Thank you all. So I'll be sharing my slides here. Just a quick tech check. Can you all see the slide deck? Okay, great. Well, hi everyone. My name is Dan Sakaguchi. I'm a staff researcher with Communities for a Better Environment, and I'm going to be joined tonight by Ann Alexander, who is a senior attorney with the Natural Resources Defense Council. Just want to say thank you to Council members Martinez, Jimenez, and McLaughlin for placing this agenda item on for tonight. We're here to provide an external analysis of some recent announcements that the Chevron Corporation has made about the future of their energy business and what they mean for Richmond, because fundamentally we believe the public has a right to know. And we're also going to offer some context based off of the refinery transitions that we're seeing next door in Rodeo and Martinez, as Councilman Martinez just mentioned. And so for clarity, just to avoid the suspense, here's some high-level conclusions that we're going to be getting to, but just up front of the presentation. Overall, Chevron has not announced any major short-term changes in Richmond from what we've seen. What we're really seeing, though, is greenwashing, which we're going to break down and talk a little bit more about in our presentation. In the long term, though, really should be expecting some significant changes for Richmond, and potentially the expansion of hydrogen operations and potentially a biofuel conversion. And so with that, let's dive in. On September 14th, Chevron made an announcement to the public and to their investors in something that they called an energy transition spotlight. And tonight you're going to see annotated selected slides from Chevron's own presentation. Our announcement covered alternative energy technologies like carbon capture and renewable gas, but our discussion tonight is going to focus on two particular commodities that are very relevant for Richmond. And those are hydrogen and biofuels. And we're going to start with hydrogen. As Chevron has highlighted in their spotlight presentation, the company plans to leverage their current hydrogen operations to expand into the hydrogen market. And they're calling what they're saying they want to create in Richmond a hydrogen hub. Before getting into that, though, I want to offer just some basics about hydrogen. So I think some terms are important. In recent years, hydrogen has received a lot of media attention as a potential bridge fuel to a decarbonized future. And in some ways, this hype makes sense, but in many cases, it's been overblown. And in general, decarbonizing California requires converting the transportation sector away from burning fuels through electrification, while also moving our electricity sector to 100% zero-emission renewables. However, certain transportation sectors, like long-haul trucking, aviation, maritime shipping, are really challenging to electrify right now, and some believe that hydrogen could be a useful fuel for those sectors. And separately, hydrogen also could be helpful for storing electricity. So hydrogen might have a legitimate role in decarbonization, not saying that it doesn't. However, industry, and particularly fossil fuel industry, has tried to convince the public that hydrogen is really required far beyond these very limited uses. And this is really dangerous because hydrogen itself is not a zero-carbon fuel, at least the way that it's most commonly produced right now. And the climate impact of hydrogen really depends on the process that's used to create it. You're going to hear a lot about three different colors of hydrogen, and each of which has a very different climate impact. To start with, gray hydrogen, the far left here, is just the status quo of hydrogen production. It's a process that takes in natural gas, it processes it with steam and heat, it produces hydrogen, but also large quantities of carbon dioxide that get emitted into the atmosphere. And the hydrogen plant at the Richmond refinery is an example of gray hydrogen capacity. Today, most of the hydrogen that's produced in California is produced by refineries on site and third-party companies nearby as a chemical feedstock for refining. And just to throw some numbers out there, in the United States, 99% of hydrogen is gray hydrogen produced using this method, and is a major contributor to climate pollution from fossil fuel refining. Now, recently, fossil fuel companies have been marketing the idea of, quote, blue hydrogen. And this would involve the same process as gray hydrogen. However, instead of emitting the carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, the companies would attempt to capture and store the carbon somehow. Would say, though, that blue hydrogen right now is mostly a hypothetical idea with only a handful of commercial scale projects in the United States. And it's likely not that much better for the climate than gray hydrogen. We can get into that if the council is interested. Much of the carbon will remain uncaptured and even in a blue hydrogen system. And really any process that involves the transportation, the storage, and the processing of fossil fuels will have leakages across the system and impact the climate. So it leaves us the last color of hydrogen, green hydrogen. And green hydrogen, that is zero carbon hydrogen, can be produced by using water as an input rather than natural gas. So different process, different inputs, and splitting out the hydrogen by using 100% zero carbon electricity. Now to say, there's a lot of processes out there that will claim to produce green hydrogen, but right now, what you see on the screen is the only established way to produce zero carbon hydrogen. And also say, numbers are important, currently green hydrogen is only a tiny fraction of the hydrogen that's produced, mostly as small-scale pilot projects. And so this brings us back to the original point of hydrogen, is that we just simply don't need it in many sectors, and that even if we're using truly green hydrogen, if we can electrify the end use, for example, using an electric car versus a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle, we really should because it's much more efficient. And so with this context in mind, we're going to turn back now to Chevron's plans in Richmond to create what they call a hydrogen hub. And so now going back to Chevron's slides, here's the most detailed slide in their presentation about how Chevron plans to do this. So first, I've added a highlight in yellow here. Chevron intends to leverage their existing gray hydrogen capacity from Chevron's hydrogen plant. And because I think context is important, here I've compared basically before and after the modernization project. So during Chevron's modernization project approved back in 2014, Chevron expanded the capacity of their hydrogen plant. And so on the left and right here, you're seeing the hydrogen plant capacity, which also includes from their hydrogen recovery unit. Bringing this new hydrogen plant online was also responsible for many of the flaring events that we saw for the last 2 years. I'll just put that out there. And this expansion that they received through the modernization project is, perhaps coincidentally, perhaps not, the exact amount of excess capacity that Chevron now intends to sell, they just announced. And also, we just say, because of the modernization project, that Chevron's hydrogen plant is actually permitted to an even higher capacity than the project that was ultimately built. So theoretically, Chevron could take advantage of this additional capacity. Next, I'm going to turn to the, quote, green projects that Chevron is proposing. And just for sense of scale, I'm keeping up on the right-hand side here the existing gray hydrogen capacity from their hydrogen plant. So the green H2 pilot projects you see on the slide here refers to two different projects. I'll break them down first. The first is a project proposal that was actually originally conceived by MCE, who approached Chevron with the idea of converting its existing MCE Solar 1 field, which you can see on the left here, into a green hydrogen facility. And I'd say this project, if it's approved and constructed, appears to meet the definition I said earlier of what green hydrogen looks like, but it's very, very much a pilot project. And so on the right-hand side there, on top of the gray hydrogen, I've added a bar that is to scale the additional green hydrogen capacity that would come from this project. And if you can't see it, there's a reason. The existing gray hydrogen capacity is nearly 700 times that of this proposed project. And so the other project that's proposed in the slide here is the pilot at the West Contra Costa sanitary landfill that would use biomass from the landfill to produce hydrogen. And would say it's also being produced at a very small level. Also, it's using a different process. It's not using water as an input. And so this really needs further review to verify that it actually is, in fact, zero carbon hydrogen. Okay, enough about hydrogen. Now let's talk about biofuels. So while there's a wide range of technologies out there that can be used to produce biofuels, at its core, biofuels are just fuels that have similar properties to those produced from petroleum, except they're made with biomass, which is just a fancy word for stuff from living things. And while Chevron has only made hydrogen announcements for Richmond, biofuel conversions can raise many questions and concerns, which Anne is going to talk about in just a moment. Currently in California, we're aware of 5 refineries that have proposed to convert to either co-process or exclusively process biomass into biofuels. And while there are projects that have been proposed across the state, 2 of the largest projects are just next door in Martinez and Rodeo. And so now I'm going to pass it over to Ann Alexander, who's going to share a little bit more about these proposed projects.
Good evening. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. As Dan mentioned, I am a senior attorney with the Natural Resources Defense Council based in our San Francisco office, working on oil and gas related issues throughout the state of California. And I want to talk to you about the proposed biofuel conversions in the neighboring Marathon Martinez and Phillips 66 Rodeo refineries. But as Dan has also indicated, these are not the only 2 conversions going on. This is not only a statewide trend, it's actually a national and international trend toward conversion of crude oil refineries to biofuels, which raises the question initially, why is this happening? And there are really 2 main answers to that. The first answer is that biofuels are subsidized rather heavily. Here in California, we have the low carbon fuel standard, which subsidizes this type of fuel production. There are many federal subsidies as well, and these projects would not be possible for the most part without subsidies of that nature. But the additional question is, why are the conversions happening now? And the answer to that really has to do with the shifting economics of oil refining. Again, there's a lot of complex economic questions around that, but the main one to keep in mind is that most California refineries are set up in terms of their chemistry, their abilities to process California crude. And California crude oil production has been steeply declining over the last several decades, and it's getting to a point where it is somewhat critical for the refineries. So that's the why. Let's look at the what. Next slide, please. So the two conversions were announced basically last year in the summer of 2020. What bears note about that is that Marathon Martinez in late spring first announced that they were closing their refinery, and they did that. And then in late summer, they announced that they were going to convert to biofuels. So somewhere in there, they changed their mind. Phillips 66 also announced in late summer, although interestingly, and I'll get to this in a moment, they have been quietly moving toward winding down some of their operations. So about a year ago, the applications were submitted to Contra Costa County for these conversions. And then in early 2021, the county, which is charged with the permitting, kicked off the CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act review process. And at that point, the county invited scoping comments. And scoping basically means where people can submit comments about what they think the review should cover, which we did, and I'll talk about that momentarily too. After they worked on these for a number of months, the county issued the draft environmental impact reports required by CEQA earlier this month with a public comment period that ends in mid-December of this year. Construction of these projects will start after they get their permit. No one can say exactly when that is. The refineries, in our understanding, have in mind that they will have their permits by sometime early mid next year. That may or may not be realistic, but if they do, they will be under construction until sometime in 2024 with estimated completion in mid to late 2024. Next slide, please. So these projects are being presented by the project proponents as essentially an unalloyed environmental benefit. The superficial claim is these are crude oil refineries. We are going to convert them to processing renewable feedstocks instead of crude, and therefore that is good. And the type of claims being made are summarized here. Phillips 66 is claiming to slash their greenhouse gas emissions by half, and even more than that in terms of their criteria pollutants. Marathon has even greater claims for their reductions. Next slide, please. We in the environmental community have questions. And we submitted these questions in the context of our scoping comments, and we are still waiting for answers, and we'll continue to ask them. But just I wanted to give you a brief rundown of some of the types of questions that we've been asking and ways in which we think that the claims of environmental benefit need to be unpacked a little more. The first question we have has to do with the baseline for determining what the benefits of the projects are. And what I mean by that is you have to start from somewhere in saying what the status quo is that's being changed in order to figure out what you think the project benefits are going to be. And in this case, they're saying the baseline where we're starting from is continued crude oil refining, in which case, yes, if you produce biofuels and you produce less of them, you will have smaller emissions. But to us, it is a real question based on the evidence that's out there, whether in fact, if these permits were not issued, these refineries would continue processing crude or whether they would simply shut down. We know that Marathon had already shut down their refinery at the point they announced these conversions. In addition to that, Phillips 66 was already looking at shutting down their Santa Maria refinery. So that's a really big question, is what would happen if these permits weren't issued? Are we actually talking about allowing them to increase emissions from what would otherwise be there? So that's a big question. Another big question has to do with possible harm from the feedstocks that they plan to use, that they plan to process. They claimed initially that they would be using just a lot of waste oil, essentially what's left over at McDonald's after they make the French fries. There really isn't a lot of that, and there certainly isn't enough, it's becoming clear, to produce the volume that these refineries are talking about producing. So they're going to turn to food crops like soy and corn oil. That has some obvious implications for food markets, for land use. We're talking about a really monumental increase in the amount of these crops that are grown and brought into California. There's the question of the continued use of gray hydrogen. Won't belabor that because Dan's been talking about it, but if you repurpose the refinery to continue for decades, potentially into the future, you're really locking in gray hydrogen use unless you convert to cleaner hydrogen. There is concern that processing these feedstocks is going to increase the risk of process upsets, which basically means flaring. We want the regulators to look at that. There is concern that the volume of feedstock that would be produced by all of these proposed conversions would add up to a lot more liquid biofuels that are really anticipated and called for in California's climate pathways, which are looking to gravitate much more toward electric vehicles. And then finally, there's the question of site cleanup. On these conversions, the clock will be ticking because California is moving in a zero combustion direction. So if they're going to do this, they really need to be looking at the potentially multi-billion-dollar cleanups that are going to happen at this site. So I am going to stop there and turn it back over to Dan.
Great. Thanks, Anne. Appreciate it. So we're now going to turn back to Chevron's announcements on biofuels. So in the coming years, Chevron is planning a threefold increase in biofuel operations. This is company-wide we're looking at right now. And these are focused on technologies that produce replacements specifically for petroleum diesel and for jet fuels. We just note here that biofuel technologies for gasoline replacements are not really commercially scaled at this point. And here's a map from Chevron's presentation without any annotations added of their planned transitions for their U.S. refineries and operations. And we're going to go through these transitions from east to west. So early this year, Chevron secured access to soybean crushing capacity to process soybean oil into biofuels in the South and the Midwest. Chevron also secured access to process corn into biofuel jet fuel. In California and SoCal, Chevron is already testing processing biofuel jet fuel production at their El Segundo facility. And then the one that we're probably most interested in tonight, as you can see, Chevron has also circled the Richmond refinery for, quote, potential hydroprocessing unit conversions. And so while there's no proposed biofuel project on the table today, we do think that this means that a potential expansion of hydrogen production and potential conversion, in general, this means that Richmond should be prepared to evaluate such a project proposal in the near future. And again, just kind of building off of what Anne was mentioning, why biofuels? So one of the reasons why refineries are doing this is because refineries are expensive assets, and they will likely become obsolete or stranded, the term, as zero-emission technology gets cheaper. And so converting into a biofuel refinery is one way to squeeze a little bit more profit they can from these facilities. So just to sum up everything that we've presented tonight, so in the near future in Richmond, we expect continued use and potential expansion of the primarily gray hydrogen production as Chevron builds out their hydrogen hub concept. And while there are technically 2 green or greener hydrogen projects that are being proposed, they're so tiny in scale compared to Chevron's gray hydrogen production. In the longer term, we really should expect some type of conversion at this facility, potentially hydrogen-intensive biofuels, which should raise many open questions about community and worker safety and impacts. And whatever transition we see, we must make sure that it's just and equitable for both Richmond community and workers. I'm going to stop there. Thank you all for your time tonight, and we welcome any questions.